basis of J-Reps. Well, first of all, people confuse the concept of J-Reps with that of different variables such as stage reps, stutter reps, partials, 21 method, and that's not the case. J-Reps is an actual methodology of training, whereas these other so-called methods are really variables or a variation of how to perform a repetition. There's nothing very specific or concrete about J-Reps in terms of how it is performed. So therefore it's an actual methodology. It even does away with the full range repetition in that a person would throw in the odd full range rep for whatever reason in the odd set, as opposed to utilizing it as the actual basis of performing a set. So if I were to define J-Reps, I would say that it is a method that incorporates any potential combination of movement pattern to tax an entire range by means of optimizing the muscular inroad of various zones that constitute an exercise's range of motion. This methodology, this concept, is to leave no aspect of the full range untapped. The end result is far superior muscle and strength building effect in fewer sets than what is possible through traditional full range methods or means. The J-Rep method originated with my work on the Bowflex. The Bowflex uses power rod technology, which is very similar to using an elastic band, in that the more the rod's bent, the more resistance you would experience. Now, it didn't take long to realize that many exercises did not have an ideal or optimal feel, in that some sections were far too difficult, others somewhat difficult, and others still not difficult enough. So my objective was to flatten the force curve to make the exercise more productive by training each exercise in zones, so that once I was finished one zone, moved into the next, that so-called easier zone did not feel so easy after all because of the pre-fatigue of the previous zone. Well, what I wanted to do from that point, I realized that it was very effective in terms of the overall feel, working the Bowflex into sections or zones. So I wanted to apply this method to other equipment, cables, free weights, and different variable resistance equipment. And there was a noticeable effect that exceeded the idea of just simply flattening the force curve. So that was the concept behind stage reps. Work into zones from the hardest to the easiest, so that you more or less flatten the force curve for a better overall feel. But I knew there was something more to it than that, in that there had to be details developed around this methodology, because there certainly was a greater measure of pump, there's a greater measure of growth within the muscles, there was a greater measure of even the appearance. The muscles looked much larger and thicker from workout to workout. Now, the irony is that there was such an obvious effect from this style of training, but it hasn't been exploited or really pursued within the fitness industry to any great extent. And what myself and a number of other people have been doing is researching and looking into this method in a practical sense. We have the theoretical aspects of why it probably works, but we wanted to then discover the details behind it to optimize the actual effect and determine that the effect was very specific to this method. This is much different than simply performing stage reps of working from the hardest to the easiest zones, because with J-Reps you can actually attack the various zones in different ways. You don't necessarily go from the hardest to the easiest, and as well, the details behind J-Reps makes it very distinct. Fundamentally, I needed to determine how long a set should last in order to optimize the effect, and how many repetitions, tension time per zone, things along those lines. And what I determined as a basic building block is that each set should last approximately 60 seconds. This would permit a weight that was not too light, not too heavy. It'd stay within the anaerobic energy system, and it would still work very well to optimize muscle hypertrophy and strength. Now, some people do have different responses to exercise. You may have a person who has a lot of slow twitch muscle fibers, very poor response to exercise, high endurance. that person may need to exceed the 60-second range to around 70-75 seconds, for example. Other people have a very tremendous response to exercise, very good response, a lot of fast twitch muscle fiber, and they don't have the endurance capacity, and their sets may be around maybe 45-50 seconds. They probably get a better response in that regard. We know there are arguments about this particular point, but I do believe that more contractions per unit of time are superior than fewer contractions per unit of time. In other words, with all other factors remaining equal, 6 repetitions are superior than 3 repetitions over, say, a minute of tension time. Now, taking that concept a bit further, I wanted to determine how many contractions I could achieve over 60 seconds while maintaining good quality control while working like a piston, moving from point A to point B, squeezing in, releasing out. And so I took the 60-second tension time, divided an exercise in half, the most difficult half followed by the easier half, and determined that I could perform 12 contractions in 30 seconds while maintaining control. Now this means 1 second on the positive, 1 second on the negative, with slight pauses at either ends of the range of motion within that particular zone. Well, it certainly has a bearing when you consider the execution of a traditional set, full range of movement training compared to J-Reps. With traditional training, a person will achieve muscular fatigue once in a set. And when that happens, it occurs at a particular point, which means that a very small section of the entire range of movement has been fatigued to an optimal amount. With J-Reps, a person is achieving fatigue 2 to 3 times, possibly more depending on the J-Rep methodology, but at least 2 or 3 times. And this, in effect, has a much greater bearing on the result of that set, simply because the entire range is worked much more effectively and thoroughly, especially when considering the multiple repetitions that are being executed, around 24 within 60 seconds. If we were to observe bodybuilders in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, before the actual use of drugs, before the mass production of quality exercise machines, we would note that they trained differently. They had access primarily to the free weights, barbells, and dumbbells, and nothing else. Now, free weights does not lend itself very well to full range of movement exercise. There are fall-offs, there are sticking points, there are highs and lows. And as a result, bodybuilders from decades ago had to train more experimentally. They had to be more creative in terms of how they applied the exercise. And that often meant working within a shorter range of motion, whether it be a half or quarter, 3/4 of the range, depending on the exercise. They also worked in a more rhythmic manner to achieve that big muscular pump. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, Arthur Jones came along with his variable resistance machines, and he certainly knew the importance of exercise throughout the full range to optimize strength, to challenge as many muscle fibers as possible. But what J-Reps does is to optimize that effect, regardless of the equipment, whether you're using cables or free weights. We're going back to the roots of bodybuilding, whereby we're working in a very rhythmic manner, very controlled and rhythmic, trying to achieve that optimum pump, but at the same time allowing an individual to customize the set of how it should feel from one zone to the next or throughout the entire range of movement, which makes it far more effective than any machine on the market. We need to define what we're talking about. It's not the taking of a light weight and pumping up a muscle through many repetitions, but performing very intense muscular contractions under a sufficient load and while straining against that pump as it builds or develops within the muscle. Now, if we look at hypertrophy, if you were to lift a sufficient load, you are affecting the number of muscle cells within the muscle fibers, and that causes hypertrophy. But we have a second aspect of hypertrophy, the expansion of the vascular system. greater numbers of mitochondria, and even a greater amount of sarcoplasm, or the interstitial fluid, in and around muscle cells. And these increase because of the fluid pressure built up under the direction of those intense muscular contractions and while the pump develops. What makes the J-Rep method so effective is that you are getting so many contractions per unit of time. You are achieving muscular fatigue more than once within a very short period, and all these things contribute or enhance the pump that a person experiences. And at the very least, even if the pump had no bearing on hypertrophy, which I believe is quite the opposite, we have to look at the psychological effect of getting a muscle pump. Anyone who achieves a good pump in the muscles will tell you that they are motivated to train harder and more frequently, or perform more sets, or be encouraged to go back to the gym, simply because of that euphoria that they experience because of that muscular pump. There's certainly more localized fatigue than systemic fatigue, and to qualify that, with J-Reps, the objective is to relax as much of the body while putting greater emphasis, more targeting, more squeezing or flexing within the muscles that you're trying to train. With traditional full range training, especially with high intensity training enthusiasts, there's this over reliance on the entire body, coordinating to squeeze, to lift up as much weight as possible for a prescribed number of repetitions. As a result, people experience, once again, that systemic fatigue, which they also label nervous system fatigue. They feel this drain throughout the entire bodies, and it's because of the over-reliance of the full body integration to lift weights. Now, a related factor is that the muscles tend to be much fuller, thicker from workout to workout using J-Reps. You could take 4 or 5 days off and you still have that thick appearance. With traditional training, you do not have that effect. It's almost as if you tend to flatten out or not look quite as full in the muscles as what you did on the day that you train, of course, but even a few days thereafter. And people tend to become so paranoid about it that they're anxious to hurry up and get back into the gym to train so they get that full appearance again. With J-Reps, you maintain that full appearance from one workout to the next. The reason why you probably maintain that look, that thick look, is once again because of that localized targeting effect that occurs with J-Reps. You just don't get that with traditional full range training. And because of this targeting effect, particularly with all those repetitions, upward of 24 repetitions in 60 seconds, you're utilizing far more glycogen for energy. And so when you consume carbohydrate after a workout, you get a much greater overcompensation effect. And this should indicate something, the importance of carbohydrates in the diet, that you not only need carbohydrate to replenish energy resources utilized during exercise, to replenish that glycogen and to aid in recovery of the muscles, but also that you need sufficient carbohydrate to have that full, thick appearance in the muscles, to have that overcompensation effect. I'd like to describe the various aspects of the J-Rep methodology. I'm sitting atop of an upright chest press machine, provides variable resistance, so it begins off somewhat challenging and it gets progressively more challenging as you press up. There's a slight drop off toward the top simply because of the lockout of the elbows, which provides you greater leverage. Now, knowing this information, we can then divide an exercise into zones or sections. The hardest zone is in the middle, so that would be performed first, followed by the top zone, and then the bottom zone. If we were to divide this exercise into halves, we would have the top half, followed by the bottom half. Now, knowing this information and going by the feel, we can also determine the limits of the range of motion for each zone, both the top and bottom. If we were to completely lock out, we take the stress off the muscle, so we want to remain within a few inches of complete lockout in this instance. Bringing the weight down too far, you can feel it going through that sticking point, that hardest zone, but too far down and it becomes a bit easier. Same thing in pressing up, in that when you press it up, it's almost like hitting a wall. You can feel it becomes very difficult, and you can sense where that range needs to stop. Now we can make this even a little more complex. Say that we wanted to divide the exercise into two halves, but we can avoid that middle sticking point, those 2-3 inches where it is most difficult. We can work the top half minus that particular zone right toward the bottom of the top half. Then we can work the bottom half minus the 2 or 3 inches in the middle. So in effect, what we are doing is adding more weight to the bar or to the machine and working those two zones minus the sticking point so we can have greater overload on the muscles. And it does provide quite a different and unique feel relative to standard halves or thirds, for example. Now, understanding the nuances of the various zones within an exercise or range of motion helps us to customize or manipulate the exercise as a whole. For example, suppose you wanted to perform halves, your top half and bottom half of this particular exercise. You underestimate your strength. You find the weight not quite heavy enough. You may want to stop the set, add more weight, or you could do some improvisation. For example, you know that it's more difficult toward that midpoint. So what you can do is perform what I refer to as J-Rep fractals, squeezing and releasing 1-2 inches of movement during that most difficult area. And once you build sufficient fatigue, you then move into the remainder of the range of motion and continue until you fatigue that area. You then move into the bottom, and suppose that also feels a bit lighter than what you expected or intended. Move back into that difficult area. Squeeze it out again until you develop sufficient fatigue. Then finish the movement with the remainder of that zone's range of motion. So that's one example of improvisation, or manipulating, changing the zones and how you attack the set. And improvisation will be discussed more later on in this video, and it certainly is discussed in greater detail in the book. So far we learned how to divide an exercise based on its range of movement and how an exercise feels throughout that range, so we can create zones. The next aspect is to understand the function of the muscle being trained. In this instance, this particular exercise is working the pectorals, the triceps, and the shoulders. But because I want to work my pectorals, and this is a chest training workout, I want to keep my concentration on the pecs. So I disassociate myself from the remainder of the muscles and think about the pecs more specifically. So the function of the pecs is to draw the arms across the body, as we see in a pec deck or as we see in dumbbell flies. So we take that same imagery and apply it to a chest press movement. And this helps you to create that greater mind muscle link so that your focus is not on lifting of the weight, but more on the contraction or feel and function of the muscle. So with the pecs stretching out, the elbows also go out, and as the elbows move in toward the midline of the body, you squeeze the pecs together. It's almost as if you have an orange between your pecs and you're trying to make orange juice. You're squeezing that orange with everything you've got. Now, of course, in zone training, you're working on sections at a time, but it's all about squeezing, releasing the muscle. Squeeze, release. Same thing with the bottom. Squeeze, release. Squeeze, and release. There's a particular movement technique involved in J-Reps. You want to maintain absolute control while working in a rhythmic, steady fashion. And the first rule of that is certainly do not use more weight than what is appropriate relative to the exercise and what you're trying to achieve. Too many people tend to overexert their muscles, use too much weight, and they're cheating, bouncing the weight without having proper control. Rather, once again, focus on the muscular action taking place and work in that proper rhythm. Squeeze, release, squeeze, release, squeeze, release. And you'll see that there are short pauses at either end of the range of movement. Slight pause, squeeze, slight pause, squeeze. Then you release, upward at the top, slight pause, release, slight pause. You want to make sure that you maintain that quality of control throughout the set. Now, of course, the last few repetitions will be a bit slower than what the other repetitions are, simply because you are fatiguing and you are losing muscle force output. The next aspect to consider is proper breathing. When you take in air, you are delivering oxygen, fresh blood, and nutrients to the muscles to help facilitate their contraction. When you breathe out, you are expelling carbon dioxide and helping to remove any exercise byproducts as a result of energy breakdown. Now, proper breathing consists of letting your air out when you lift a weight, taking your air as you lower the weight. This also builds up the thoracic pressure to then support the next positive movement. J-Rep methodology is no different in that you want to take in air when you lower the weight, breathe out when you lift it. And in this fashion, the rhythm of the breathing helps to support the rhythm of the movement and vice versa. Now, an interesting point is that rhythmic, steady breathing also helps to increase the muscular pump that you will experience or achieve. It even helps to recover the muscle during the set itself. Holding your breath will cause the set to be reduced somewhat because of the build of carbon dioxide and those exercise byproducts from the intense muscular contractions. Now, you can utilize this tip to your best advantage between exercises. So whether you're resting 10 seconds, 60 seconds, what have you, whether you are walking to the next machine, setting up equipment, waiting for a machine, or cycling yourself up, breathe in a very steady state rhythmic fashion, deep rhythm. This not only helps you to recover between exercises, between sets, but it also enhances the muscular pump that you achieve between those sets.
Alright, here Steve is doing J-Rep halves, but we're using the aboriginals to completely take his bicep out of the equation till the end of the set. He's working the top half of the movement, strictly pulling with the aboriginals, no weakness of the bicep. And now he's going to move into the bottom and work just the shrugging movement. Again, keeping the biceps out of the back work. The biceps remain fresh. Showing that zone training, allowing you to break up the zones, allows you to have a lot more control over manipulating the weak and the strong parts of an exercise. Excellent, Steve. Keep it going. Squeeze it out. Good. Now here Steve has got his fresh biceps and he's moving in a little higher. He's moving into the mid-range. I'm going to spot him a little tough, so he's got his fresh biceps, fatiguing him through the mid-range. Try to pull the top, Steve. Try to pull this top. Good. Squeeze it out. Performing a J-Rep crisscross. We're going to work in the beginning, we're going to split the exercise into the top zone and the bottom zone. Top zone is going to start relatively light. Bottom zone is going to start with the full stack. Like a pyramid set, we're going to bring the top zone heavier and we're going to lighten the bottom zone until he hits a mid-range weight where he'll work the middle of the exercise. Ready, Steve? Enter. And top zone. Steve just squeezing in the top third. Not necessarily exactly the top third, where it feels best. He doesn't have to do too many, he's just getting warmed up and pumped. And now relax, we'll go into the bottom zone. Let her go. I'm loading up the stack to the full 250. Are you ready? And squeeze. 1, 2, 3, 4. Really tough here, really tough here. 6, 2 more, 7, last one, squeeze into it, 8, relax out, let you out. Now we're going back to the top zone and cranking her up to 100 pounds into the top. Now even at 100 pounds, the top zone is going to feel quite a bit heavier after 250 at the bottom. Top zone's harder in this exercise, which is why we start lighter there. That's 3. As the top zone's getting heavier, we're bringing his top zone sets closer to failure. 2 more. 1, 2, ease into the bottom. Let you out. Now we're dropping full 3 plates. We're back in the bottom, but he can keep going because we're slightly lighter. Typical strip set style. Still really quite heavy. 4. Pushing failure. 5. 6. 7. Try for 1 more. 8. Excellent. Ease that. Let me have it. No rush. Again, I'm increasing the weight in the top zone. 130. Take a deep breath, Steve. Up to the top. Good. 3. Now he's fatiguing a lot quicker. Ease down into the bottom. Excellent, excellent. Let it off. 1 more at the bottom. We're at 160. We're almost meeting in the middle. Squeeze. Squeeze. Excellent. Dig deep, Steve. Dig deep. Deeper than you ever have. Control. 1 more. Let her go. Now take a break for a sec. Deep breaths, Steve. Deep breaths. Deep breaths. We're going to finish the set at 140 in the middle. We've brought 80 into 140, 250 into 140. I think it's just about right for him. Deep breaths. We're not going to give him too much rest. Not more than 20 seconds. Hit that mid-range, Steve. Hit that mid-range. Stay in the mid-range. 3, 4, keep working. 6. Good set, Steve.
Steve is performing chin-ups one side at a time, but the way he's going to be doing this is working it in zones while using an arm sling for the top position, then a lat shrug in the bottom position, and then once his lats are quite fatigued, you then will use his arm muscle to work the mid-range. So we're going to start with the top section of the movement. The left side is working predominantly. The right side is only helping as much as is necessary. Very intense contractions taking place. He's working for approximately 8 repetitions. Now he's down to pretty much body weight. Do nothing more than left lat shrugs while the right hand stabilizes movement. He's creating greater fatigue in that left lat. His biceps are still fresh.